welcome Enith from the beaches of Jamaica. I'm jealous. Um, so I always like to just share how I met our guest, and it was really I think I'm not overstating it, Enith. We had sort of a mutual instant love affair at a moral economy conference at the Garrison Institute. Organized, and if I remember correctly, there was two events, one last fall and then another one
Yes,
in the city more
yes,
recently. So,
yes,
so we've had two dates together so far in
yes,
person.
exactly.
And,
We'll soon be going
but
steady.
yeah, yeah. But there was something about Enid's energy, and maybe it was the combination of the energy and the subject matter that really struck me. And so I immediately invited her here, and so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I have to say I'm a little intimidated about today's conversation. So but Enith will put us all at ease. In light of what's happening in the world, it may seem like you know it may seem impossible, but it's actually more important to be having this conversation than ever. And that's why you're all here, and so I appreciate that as well. Um, Most of you have probably seen, there's news every day that we're trying to keep up with. But yesterday's was particularly poignant to today's conversation. And what I'm referring to is Jeff Bezos' announcement about the shift in the editorial column of the Washington Post, which he referred to as a local newspaper. And also pertinent to today's conversation is the music you just heard. And the reason I put the lyrics up is because we often listen to Bob Marley without paying attention to the words. But interestingly, the words in So Much Trouble in the World included a line, blast off on their spaceships millions of miles from reality. You see men sailing on their ego trips, blast off on their spaceships million miles from reality. So what a good way to kick off our conversation. And maybe I'll just quickly read the pertinent parts of the Bezos announcement. We are going to be writing every day in support of defense of two pillars, personal liberties and free markets. We'll cover other topics too, of course, but viewpoints opposing those two pillars will be left to be published by others. I am of America and for America, and proud to be so. Our country did not get here by being typical. And a big part of America's success has been freedom. Freedom in economic realm and everywhere else. Freedom is ethical. It minimizes coercion. And practical. It drives creativity, invention, and prosperity. And I skip a little bit, and he goes on to say, we'll be searching for a new opinion editor, because the old one just resigned on principle, to own this new direction. Own this new direction. I'm confident that free markets and personal liberties are right for America. I also believe these viewpoints are underserved in the current market of ideas and news opinion. I'm excited for us to get there to fill that void. How does that sit with you, Enith?
Good morning, everyone. It's morning. I'm in New York.
Yeah.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And Bob Marley wrote his lyrics in the 70s mostly, he started his career in the 1960s in what we euphemistically call the slums of Jamaica. Among As a descendant, actually, Bob Marley is an interesting character for this conversation. His father was a white descendant of the plantocracy, and his father was 57, and his mother was a young girl of 16. I think that's the age they use. Now, whether or not she was 16 or 14 or 13, But one can imagine the power dynamics of a 57-year-old white man, fully white, and a young girl from the hills of Jamaica, from a poor family. And the father sort of, left before Bob was even born. And so his mother moved with him into what's called Trenchtown. And if you know Bob Marley, that's, he sings about that. And Trenchtown was a place created by the government, post-emancipation, sort of in the turnover to independence, where, as you'd imagine, there's this influx of folks from the rural communities moving into Kingston in search of opportunity. And his mom moved him to Trenchtown, and it was just a absolute incredible space, because you had people coming from all there are 14 parishes in Jamaica. The more the word we use is ambitious, but those who were just the most anxious to do something different. And so they'd come and they had different ideas and different paths to get in there. And that's where, Bob grew up. And so to imagine that person writing the lyrics about people in their spaceship, miles from reality, right? No care for you, no care for me. And, Bob is a Rastafarian, and the Rastafarian religion is founded in the principle of, and I think, Sandra, you wrote it, I and I, right? I am valuable, you are valuable, I see you, you see me, we are one. And that was the sort of his shaping ethos for how he would live his life, and then that was expressed in his music. So when he speaks of there's no care for you and no care for me, and when he is pejorative about people with egos, he's speaking to a fundamental demand of us as humans to be human with each other, right? See me, I see you. You're not all powerful. You may have an ego that tell you that you are, but we're all human. And so, as I listen, and John, as you've read Jeff's
Actually,
words.
let me comment on one other piece of the lyrics that are just so, it's incredible. Again, he wrote it in the 1970s.
70s, yes.
The you see men sailing on their ego trips,
Good
and
trips.
there's no artifact that I could think of that better expresses that than the boat Bezos built.
Yes,
The
yes.
literal sailboat that this guy built is what Marley wrote about in
Was what Martin,
50 years
and of
ago.
course, there's Blue Origin, right? I remember the
Well,
sailboat
that's the
could not
rocket ship
even get
part.
out of the docks
Yeah,
at Rotterdam because it was so big, right? So they
yeah,
had to literally
exactly.
dismantle the
Yeah,
bridge to get it
exactly.
out. So the
And
ego, the sense
yeah,
of self-aggrandizement, the sense
exactly.
of I am bigger than everything in this
Yeah,
planet. And we remember, what was it, $20 billion for 6 seconds looking
yeah,
down on us,
yeah, yeah.
right? So it went up.
With
Oh, I'm
the
looking down at
symbol of
everybody.
his new girlfriend on the bow, with the,
And
I
then
mean, you
reality
couldn't,
brought him down to earth,
yeah,
i.e., gravity, right? He couldn't stay up there.
yeah.
And you think about the other person who has who has rocket ships. The same ego is
Oh, that occurred to
right.
me.
Right. No, yeah. Same person,
Yeah,
same persona.
yeah,
Also miles from reality, right? And so as I listened to as you read his reasoning for the change in the editorial policy, right? The opinion policy,
yeah,
I thought, in 50 years or in 20 years or in 10 years, when the Washington Post folds, and I'm making a prediction, Jamaicans do it, you know, when the Washington Post ceases to have relevance, when it ceases to be a trusted voice, will this be the obituary? Will he have, because when you assert principles that you're absolutely not defending, and when you assert that your view of how you are to be in the world is to continue to be harmful, to
right.
continue to perpetuate a lie, an untruth, and that you're going to ensure that every word you write from now in your opinion pages will be shaped by this idea of freedom, personal liberty, and free markets, all of which we can contest and take apart and interrogate in the history of America and say it's never been present.
But I actually, and for those who, I mean, it's, we're all probably preaching to the choir here, which is a problem. But both of us come from a different world where
Yeah.
those words would be believed, like genuinely believed, by good people who are
Yes.
smart,
Mhm.
successful,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
genuinely believe that narrative
Yeah.
without having really questioned it.
Yeah.
And it's a real eye opener, to have frankly the courage to look under the hood
Yeah.
and really process that. And I don't know, obviously, where Bezos stands on all this, whether it's just ignorance, or not. But I saw him interviewed on a business, it was at some conference, and he was of course, he was the star on stage, one-on-one interview with, I forget the journalist's name, the business journalist. He
Mhm.
said something, it was a real tell. He said
Mhm.
something to the effect, I tried to look for it this morning, I couldn't find it, but he said something to the effect of, um, it usually doesn't pay to go against reality, or something like that. In other words, he was he was making the case. The context was, why are you sucking up to Trump?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and why were you in the front row, and blah blah
Mhm.
blah. But
Mhm.
he wrapped it all in a narrative of, this is the way the winds are blowing, and
Mhm.
if you want to be successful, you usually don't stick your nose into the wind, which was just such a tell about his complete
Yeah.
depravity as a human
Yeah.
being,
Yeah. Yeah.
as
Yeah.
as as
Yeah.
his humanity, and I don't say that with malice. It's an observation, that his success, as we defined it, literally puts a blinder on his ability to even see the ignorance of the words coming out of his mouth.
And,
Uh,
Deborah just wrote in the chat, whose reality, right? And I think that is foundational to our discussion around reparations and regenerative economy. Whose reality are
yeah,
we looking at? Where are we looking at the reality, the
yeah,
moment, from which lens, right? And one of the practices, one of the this critical thinking framework that we all work towards is to be able to understand other people's perspectives, understand where they're coming from, and in pursuit of free markets, exploit it, right? So let me go and understand the natives and figure out, what is
yeah.
their secret sauce for longevity, and then let me come back and package it and, put it in a pretty box and get Madison Avenue to market it back to them as, coconut water, right? So that's also reality. But to the point, again, about just how are we collectively, individually looking at freedom? That is, we spoke about, the foundational document of the United States, the Constitution, and everyone claims the Constitution, right? It is me. It
Right.
is you. It is how, as Americans, and this is a very American conversation, but I know that this is a global audience. But the
Yeah.
moment we're in, is uniquely American, but it's also uniquely global. And one of the questions you asked me, John, was, how is this resonating with the folks in Jamaica?
Yeah.
And how it resonates with the folks in Jamaica, and I would say certainly the folks in the global South, but also as we see in Europe, is America is, for better or for worse, the beating heart of the world, right? And partly it's because it has set itself that way. Partly it's because it has the largest military, the most powerful weapons, and also because it has managed through fair means and foul to commandeer the economic sort of systems and mechanisms of the world. So America is our global reference, right? And even those, the BRICS and others who are trying to shift the conversation, you still have to reference and refer back and go back into America. So what happens here matters.
And we need to acknowledge there's a lot of, again, going back to Bezos, there is truth. There's partial truth in what he said.
There's partial truth.
Partial
There is
truths
partial
are
truth.
often more
There's
dangerous
partial
than
truth.
lies.
But what's the reality, right? And so the foundation at the Reparations Finance Lab is that the way that we have been taught about American history, and particularly about American, the role of the private sector, the role of private capital, we have been told that private capital has been triumphant. It is because of, personal liberties, which even at the writing of the Constitution did not include people who looked like me. We were not free, and we were not written in as free.
For 2 reasons. Don't forget the first reason. You're a woman.
And I'm a woman, so I was double not free. And in fact, we then had to amend the Constitution to even make me human, to give me the right to vote, and to make me a citizen of this country, right? And and so there's that truth. And then there's also the truth that present capital was used as a tool of enforcement of non-freedom. So to say you're going to now have, our opinions champion freedom when the very notion, the very concept, the very truth that you're champion is not true. That's a special kind of that's a special kind of Jedi mind trick. And so the first call for all of us is, whose reality are we looking at? And are we looking at the same reality? And then, John, what I think about is one of the very first acts of this presidency was to deliberately seek to silence a truth. And that truth is wrapped up in DEI, wrapped up in critical race theory. It was to seek to silence that truth that America has not dealt fairly or justly or morally with. And even, DEI, as we know, it's not just about Black people, but it has become shorthand for Black people, right? And so let's not talk about it.
Before we dive into DEI, let me just on the kind of reality, whose truth piece, just really want to recommend to people. There's a number of podcasts done by John Biewen. The podcast is called Seen on Radio, which is a kind of a clever name. And he's done a series on racism, a series on patriarchy, a series on capitalism, a series on climate change. But these are, 8 to 10 season or 8 to 10 episode series that really go deeply into the reality, and in a fairly, I think, balanced way. It's not that, American capitalism is nothing but extractive from indigenous people first and then slaves. It's not like that's the whole. But he does a great job at that. So if people are keen just to get better informed, I highly recommend them. Obviously, a lot of books. And then on the British Empire, there's a podcast called Empire.
Yes.
Which is frankly too long, but also brilliant. And one of the little factoids that comes out of that is that the Brits essentially stole at gunpoint through a private company, the British East India Company, the Indian textile industry, which at the time represented 25% of global GDP. So just think about that for a second. They stole 25% of GDP at gunpoint. And that's the foundation of the wealth that exists in the British Empire. And one thing I've learned about economics is that when you start with a surplus, it works a lot better than when you start deficit.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And that surplus is capital, it's social, it's
Yeah,
access, it's, acceptance,
yeah.
personal
All forms of
bodily
surplus. Exactly.
acceptance,
Yeah,
right? It just really helps a lot, to
yeah.
have a surplus of being a good-looking white guy, John. You sort of enter the room and, all these values are ascribed to
Yeah.
you and all these opportunities are given to you. And so
Yeah.
the truth that
Hey, I didn't get into Yale, just for the record.
that's probably to your benefit,
I know.
actually.
I actually
You
see it
know,
that way. I see it that way.
we have a Yale story to talk about. Anywho.
Well, and so I do want to get to our topic at hand. One of the little factoids that one discovers when one is researching the history of slavery in the United States and which countries are engaged in reparations and why, and which countries and institutions are not. Um, I sort of knew this, but I didn't fully know this. But I'll just, where did I write this? Oh, Georgetown, Harvard, Brown, UVA, University of Virginia, University of North Carolina, UNC, Princeton, and Yale, all are built directly on the backs of slavery. And in the case of Georgetown, slaves were sold to
Yeah.
keep the institution solvent at a
Hmm.
moment. So it wouldn't
Hmm.
exist were it
Hmm.
not for the sale of slave assets.
And I would
Um,
say those are just the schools that have come forward, having done their own interrogation. But you
Interesting.
can think up and down, certainly, and what that also opens is this dialectic conversation between the North and the South, which gets us to the Civil War, right? So the
Yeah.
Northern states like to imagine that they had no business to do with slavery. They were sort of pure and, we were
Yeah.
all abolitionists in the North, right? Well, Brown University was founded by the Brown brothers, who were the most successful slavers in America, right? They
All right.
owned and established some of the first plantations in Barbados. And
Yeah.
as is done even to today, extracted wealth is morally washed through philanthropy, right? So you sort of have, however you make your money, which often is extractive, you then sort of cleanse it and put it, into the public sphere through a foundation and through good works. And that's, Brown University. And interestingly, with
And
Brown
you put your name on a
University,
university.
yeah,
And you put your name on a university.
you put your name on a university and you
Yeah.
endow that university into perpetuity. And then
Right.
in the late 1990s, you have a Black woman who, against all odds, becomes the president. And this is another side conversation, why representation matters. Ruth Simmons was elected the president of Brown. And as we like to say in the community, she understood the assignment. She's like, all right, you all make me president of this university. Let's go dig up and see how was this university made? And that is actually the moment that led to so much of this explosion of truth telling. Again, not
Yeah.
suppressing the truth, but saying, let's examine and interrogate, how did we get here? Where was the wealth of that? And so now, at the Brown University, there's the Ruth Simmons Center, and they have an amazing practice and around truth telling, enslavement. And to your point, it's not all about, lashing yourself for the harm, but it's like, how do we move on from that, right? What are the lessons? How do we repair, which is, the reparative piece of it, but how do we use the truth to lead us to a new present and a better future? And that's the beauty of having a truthful, honest, free conversation about from different perspectives.
That's the why. And
Yes.
and when one learns a bit about, and I'm no expert by any means at trauma or at intergenerational trauma, but again, thanks to artificial intelligence, you can get up to speed pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And maybe share with us, or I can share what I learned. But let's start with well, let me start with the bit that I know about, which is that money is not the issue here in the United
Right.
States. It has
No.
nothing to do with money. Part of the narrative we tell ourselves is, well, we have to balance the budget. When Musk gives his speech to the freaking pardon my French, first cabinet meeting, he starts out by saying, we're going to go bankrupt. The United States is going to go bankrupt. We have to do this. Now that is that is gaslighting the gaslighters.
Yeah.
And they
Yeah.
sit there kind of semi nodding.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
just to start with that, on the issue of reparations, it has nothing to do with money.
No.
The US printed trillions of dollars to bail out the banking system and
Yes.
trillions more dollars to bridge the gap of the collapse of the economy due to the pandemic. And we're still here.
We're still
And
here.
so it turns out when you're the United States of America and you have the ability to print the reserve currency and you have the ability to pay interest by printing interest to pay your debts, there are limits. Obviously, you can't go totally crazy, but in the context of what we're talking about, this has nothing to do with money. So
Right.
let's just establish that. And then the other
Yeah.
thing I think we need to establish is the science on trauma. And maybe I'd invite you, Enith,
Hmm.
just to remind us, educate us about how trauma, in particular intergenerational trauma, affects us, affects individual health and social health, collective health.
So important because, someone wrote again, I'm loving the chat. Thank you. Keep it coming.
How do you keep up with the chat?
It's a little bit of ADHD, not to label myself as a little bit of, um, and it is the layers of what are we talking about? And so the layers of repair, right? And reparations is actually the concept of reparations is a layered concept, right?
Right,
And
right.
within that concept, which is, the United Nations human rights definition of reparations, speaks particularly to the state compensating the citizens for the harm that it has done. So that is the traditional reparations, and that's how we all kind of understand it. And we have seen it in work, in practice, after the Rwanda genocide, at the end of apartheid, and certainly at the end of, the Holocaust, World War II. And of course, my work is working with that concept within private capital. But one of
Sorry,
the
just to clarify, you're saying the UN has defined reparations as a state practice.
compensating its citizens for the harm that it has done. And that is the classic
Yeah,
understanding of reparations and the framework that is used globally, right? It is a state repair, right?
right.
And
But that's one
so,
of the arguments that people make is that why should the state take this obligation
and
on?
so, and the first principle of the reparations framework is an acknowledgement and an apology of the harm. And
Mhm.
that is what we have skirted around in America. I'm on the beaches of
And the
Jamaica
UK.
and the UK, right? We have skirted around that acknowledgement of harm. And because if you acknowledge the harm and you issue an apology, then within the framework, it then triggers compensation frameworks, restitution, repair to this, to where you would have been had you not had the interruption, right? Rehabilitation, right? And so these are all compensation mechanism within a reparations framework. And so to go to your question of generational trauma, in the reparations movement, which is both the United States but also global, um, as a, and certainly if we understand and accept the truth that it was slavery that made the new world, right? Prior to the discovery of African bodies, the 13 original colonies were kind of struggling, right? And we think about, I was born in Jamaica, the Caribbean would sort of, nice beaches, but not much going on economically. And it was the invention of this financial mechanism to import bodies, right? Put them to work with no compensation. So therefore extract, excess capital to send it back to a Europe that was frankly not in good shape. Right. So when there's a wonderful book I always refer folks. I think I must have spoken to you, John, about it. It's Born in Blackness by the author Howard French. He's a professor at Columbia University. And for anyone who wants a deep dive in just the history of enslavement and the connection between and the encounter between Africa and the New World and Europe and the making of the New World, it's sort of a foundational book. But
if I can
to go,
interrupt just quickly, on the point. So it's the uncompensated labor and bondage was obviously a moral travesty,
yeah,
but it also just on a purely economic basis created the surplus
to create to the
that
surplus.
the capitalist system used. Think of it as it primed the pump
You prime the
that
pump. Yeah,
essentially got the whole flywheel going. And so
exactly,
it's not that
exactly.
the whole flywheel is evil, but the
Right.
flywheel, we primed the pump with slavery,
Yes.
like we primed the pump by taking land, and just like
Yes.
the Brits primed the pump. That's hard to say.
You prime the
By,
pump.
by stealing the entire
Textile industry of India.
industry from India. And when I say steal, I mean literally steal. They literally, they took they killed a lot of people, and they stole the value added piece of the industry, which is the manufacturing part, and
Yeah.
literally set it up in England. And so that, India was paid for raw materials rather than finished goods.
Yeah.
And that
When they were doing
value
finished
add was,
goods before, they were
yeah,
producing finished goods. And you're
the
like,
best
nope,
in the world,
nope,
which was
you're not going to do that.
25% of the global economy. So I
Yeah.
connecting a
Yeah.
couple dots, how is it that, because we didn't acknowledge that reality in the post-World War era, we set up the World Bank IMF architecture based on the tool of debt as a development tool, which is
Yes.
not
Yeah.
surplus, it's a
Yeah.
liability. So we
It's a
somehow,
an internal liability, right?
yeah,
Because you never get out of debt, right? And certainly not when you're able to print your way out of debt. And to sort of come back to what has been the generational cost of not just the economic cost of slavery and
yeah,
and of
science.
course, yeah, how has that impacted all of us, right? Whichever side of the table you're on, right? So there's an entire field called epigenetics, which developed and was really interrogated to explore after the Holocaust. What was the impact on the survivors of having gone through that experience? And they found literally a transmission of certain traits and behaviors, like their biology was changed. The expression of their actual I mean, yeah, genetic expression was changed.
Yeah.
Now think about enslaved people in the Americas and indigenous people who have suffered 500 years of being excluded, exterminated, othered, blamed, um, hunted down literally. Think about, Jim Crow South, where you literally would be hunted like an animal, right? Um, think about how that changes your entire theology, right? So it's not just a mind trip, right? It's not just that you're,
Yeah.
you know, um,
Yeah. You're
out of your mind with worry. Your body begins to change. And then and then think about the other side of it. What does it do, and and we haven't, because we never interrogate the winners, right? We never look and say, what is, we sort of look at the obvious things. Well, they have all the wealth, but how is that damaged the white population to know, which is why I think there's so much denial around critical race theory and DEI, to know that you are the beneficiary of injustice. What does it cost you? And I think about, sort of what we've learned from family dynamics and family therapy, it's like if there's a family secret and no one speaks about the family secret, like, grandpa was whatever, right?
yeah.
And you never speak about it,
Yeah.
that family literally is damaged,
Yeah.
right? Because and you have not spoken a truth. And in America and in the Americas, right? And there's also a conversation with the continent. We have not spoken the truth. And so we
Yeah.
are both damaged, right? We are all damaged. And
Yeah.
so truth telling is one of the foundational principles
Mm.
around a repair framework, right? So that is, you have to tell the truth, you have to acknowledge the harm, you have to figure out how do you repair, how do you compensate, and then further down, once you've gotten through that piece, you get to the piece around a commitment to non-repetition. And
Mhm.
that's, presume let's mind travel and say in the United States we finally get over our denial and we get to some sort of, you know, place where we have worked out some rehabilitation, some compensation, however, some, we also have to commit that we'll never do it again.
Mm.
Right? We will commit to
Mm.
none repetition, which means we'll have to ensure that our laws are rewritten so that we do not have, for example, we outlawed enslavement, but we kept a little bit of it that said, slavery is not in the United States except as punishment for a crime. So now we have the prison
Mm.
industrial complex that is fueled by Black bodies who are basically held in prisons. And as we saw in the fires in California, where you are, John, prisoners were part of the front line in fighting those
Yeah.
fires for pennies on the pennies, right?
Yeah.
So they were a labor force,
Yeah.
right, that
It actually
were,
strikes me they actually pay them something. It's
yes, something. So then it's not slavery, right?
yeah, I'd love to be part of that conversation. What should we pay? How about $3 an hour? Yeah, that sounds about right. Or whatever it is. It's
Yeah,
some
yeah,
fraction
yeah,
of minimum
yeah.
wage, which is not even
It's not even minimum wage,
right.
right? And
Yeah, no, it's a
there's a
fraction of
great,
minimum wage.
yeah. And so constitutional amendments to this is another chat. What would a commitment to non-repetition look like on a policy level? Yeah, it would look like a constitutional amendment because, as we know in the framework, the laws-based, the rules-based, laws-based framework of the United States, and I'll put that in quotes because we don't know what's going on right now. The reference document is the Constitution, right? So then any claim for a continuation or a repeat of denial of freedoms would need to refer to a constitutional amendment, right? So, yeah, yes to that answer. It would require that. But imagine how far we are from that today. But one of the things, Don, I wanted to talk about was what is this moment offering us? And I'm going to let you lead into that. But there is something that we are at this extreme moment. The terms we've used is polycrisis. I like to just say crazy, right? What is the moment offering us?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just on your last point about the what do you call, what's the term? Non-repeatal?
Non-repeat, the commitment to
Non-repeat.
non-repetition.
Again, just, the context of our vice president's speech in Germany, completely devoid of any awareness that that's that's obviously at the heart of what's going on in Germany.
And he's a Yale grad,
Yeah, a Yale Law School grad, which
Yale
apparently
Law
I
School
learned
grad. Maybe he
didn't
didn't
work.
spend long enough there anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the how, because you know, as I think about your work, it's very much you're trying to craft a how to deal with this reparations issue. Not you're not like arguing about the why. You're working very practically about the how. Is that a fair?
Right. Fair, very fair, very fair, very fair,
So
very fair.
tell us about your work and how you what you're doing, but also how you think about the challenge of the how. Um,
Great, thank you. So the how, the why, part of the work was establishing the why, right? You just have, part of the was saying we need to be looking at the same facts, right? Whether or not you agree with me. So it's just establishing and putting those facts out. Now the how is, how do I get a conversation with the holders of private capital that speaks to both their obligation, which is our conversation in the moral economy framework, but also, frankly, um, at their opportunity, right? And it's a it's a nuanced, frame conversation to have, because when you speak about opportunity to private capital, historically it has meant exploitation. Historically it has meant, so how can I just go in and rip the textile industry away and enrich myself? So the conversation around the morality and the need for repair, I have used the sort of the way in which we have framed and lifted up private sector involvement in the environment, right? And in being part of the solution for cooling our climate, right? And when I worked in Wall Street at Merrill Lynch, I remember we had, the colloquial term was what was called like a carbon war room, and folks were like trying to figure out, frankly, and I see what was the economic opportunity that um, the impacting on the
yeah.
environment offered, right? And then how to invest in it. So the first time I heard about things like renewables was as a banker, right? This is the future, right?
Those opportunities.
Solar is the future, wind is the future, hydrogen is the future. We were also selling water rights, so we won't even talk about that. But anywho, so I bring that lens and that sort of um, enlightened self-interest to say to private capital, here, if we think about, even within the US, but globally, but let's stick to the US for a moment, there are 41 million descendant Black people in the United States. Some of them are descendants of American slavery. Some of them, like myself, are immigrants, right? The 400 richest Americans own as much wealth as the 41 million Black folk, right? So let's sit with that. And then just another factoid, the
I'm sure it's more.
1,000 richest
I'm sure
Americans
it's
own as
more.
much wealth as all of the Black people and all of the Hispanic people in America. So that's
Yeah.
just a factoid.
Yeah.
But having worked in development economics and development finance and working, globally, one of the things we know is that a emerging market, an underserved market, is where you actually get the most returns, right? It's faster, it's swifter. And there was a paper written by Dana Peterson, another sister who understood the assignment. She was global, always, the sisters get it. She was a global head of research at Citibank, and she wrote a well regarded paper about the cost of racial underinvestment to the US economy. And what she tracked was that, the 10 years prior that she looked at, that not investing intentionally in the well-being of Black folk actually cost the US economy $1 trillion. And that if we were to intentionally invest in this, what I call an emerging market, right, we would accrue as much as 2 to 3 percentage point GDP right now. So that's like compelling. My caveat
The
is
business case for reparations.
that's the business case, but then I add on that the reparative lens that says that we must not and we must commit to the non-repetition of the extractive
Yeah.
nature of how we have engaged before, and that we must engage the community, and that we need to actually, much as we have designed a carbon market, design, frankly, a reparative market that then brings instruments that has a different return profile, including a social cohesion
Yeah.
framework.
Right.
Because one of the impacts we know of this extreme income inequality is that, and we're beginning to see it, it will inevitably, as it has throughout history and across,
Right.
societies, lead to extreme societal disruption. So,
Otherwise known as revolution.
otherwise known as revolution. And there's a Bob Marley song for that.
But just going back to your UN definition of reparations
Yeah,
and the state obligation, how
yeah,
do you, I'm sure you're not saying forget the state, let's just do it in the private sector, but
right.
how are you thinking about those two pieces of it?
Great question, and thank you for that. So there is a really active reparations movement in the US. Most of that activity is focused currently at the state and municipal level. Some of you would have heard about what has happened in Evanston, Illinois, where an amazingly brave alderwoman,
Why is
got
it always
the,
the women?
it's always the woman. I don't know.
True,
I don't know.
true.
Got approval to pay reparative payments from actually, and it was really interesting how she structured it. Robin Rose Simmons, she actually used tax receipts from the legalization of cannabis. And then you think about that whole circularity of how,
Mm.
marijuana uh, uh, arrests have just, decimated the Black community. And she's like, here's a restorative way, right? Use those tax receipts to pay citizens of Evanston who can document, particular harm around housing, right? So those initiatives are looking to the state, and there's currently a bill that's again being raised in Congress to have a federal reparations commission
This is HR 40.
established. HR 40, and it seemed as if it had died at the last Congress, but it's coming back. And the important thing for having a commission is not that the commission actually compels remedies. It does that first part of the
Right,
reparations framework, which is it compels truth telling. It
right.
compels a conversation. It compels an acknowledgement, right? So for me, those conversations are absolutely important, because again, it goes back to what reality are we, what are we looking at, what truths are we telling, what are we trying to do here, right? So I support, and I'm very supportive of, and I'm involved and engaged with the state level, the municipal level, and certainly the federal level reparations conversation. And I'm satisfied and absolutely know that once those conversations happen, and they happen with the descendant community, those who are harmed, we will work to
Yeah,
reparations that is satisfactory to those who have been harmed, because um,
yeah.
that's the final leg of the reparations framework, that there must be satisfaction from the harmed parties that what has been done is satisfactory to them. That is the final, and that's how you wrap up and say we've had a reparative
Otherwise, they're
input.
still suffering the trauma of the
Yes,
injustice.
exactly. Because, and we know it, we know from certain civil, you think about civil cases, often, saying in malpractice and everything, what always comes up is that I just want you to acknowledge that you harmed me.
Right.
I just want you to acknowledge that my
No,
pain is real.
in my own trivial little traumas of my life,
Yeah,
I tell you, I mean, I've been royally screwed in business.
yeah.
And the main thing I want is a freaking apology.
Isn't it like apology? Just an
Yeah.
apology.
Yeah.
And we think about those who are unable to give the apology and what it says about them.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So what does it say about us as a country that we can't even stomach the teaching of quote unquote critical race theory?
Yeah.
That we can't stomach the fact that little white children are going to learn that grandpa may or may not have been a member of the Ku Klux Klan.
And what's your answer for your own question? What is the answer to that question? Why can't we do that?
Because I think the big answer, one of the big answer, and I've heard it expressed, is there's a fear that we're going to ask that you return everything.
Right.
And that you pay up. And you know, the father of reparations in the United States is a Professor William Darity at Duke University, and he's done the most extensive academic research, including calculating the debt. And he has said that if we were to pay reparations, it would be 12 to 14 trillion dollars, right? You know, so you put that number out there, and everybody sort of say, "Whoa, whoa," right?
Yeah.
So there's the fear that it's going to be a $12 trillion bill. And in addition, not only a $12 trillion bill, but you're going to have to give up something. But, you know, I was on a panel last fall with
and by the way, that's just for slavery.
That's just for slavery. It's for slavery and ongoing harms. It goes into, you know, Jim Crow and goes up to, it sort of stops at the Civil Rights Act, which is where, you know, sort of an acknowledgement of sorts happened, right? But
it doesn't count the indigenous injustice.
No, this is just for Black folk, right? So to your point, I was on a panel with an indigenous leader, a tribal leader, and he said the most poignant, heartfelt thing I've heard on this topic, right? So he's, you know, Native American, original traumatized. And he said, you know, we don't want the land back. We don't want to take your land back. We don't want to push you off the land. That would make us like you. What only thing we're asking for, those places that are sacred to us, can we have them?
Yeah.
And so what he's saying is, can we have Mount Denali remain Mount Denali?
Yeah.
Like what kind of twisted perversion?
The easiest thing.
The easiest thing.
Yeah.
So we don't want to be like you and send you back,
and the name on a
back to Europe, right? Yeah. And say, give me back my land, because we're not like you. We don't see the world the way you see it. We are not about conquest.
It was never my land to begin with. It's not your land. It wasn't my land. Yeah.
We don't want to be like you. Your values are not our values, right? But we want you to respect our values. Yeah. Can we have our sacred lands?